Alright guys, today we're going to take all that energy that we get from carbohydrates and we're going to take it one step further. We're going to actually talk about what the body and what the cells do to actually use that energy. So the energy that the cell uses is ATP. It's called adenosine triphosphate, so we just call it ATP because that's a lot easier to say, and it's made in the mitochondria. Now, it's called this because it has 3 phosphate groups, but the phosphate groups are all negative, and we know that likes in science are going to repel each other. So all these phosphate groups are negative, so they're going to be repelling each other, but they're held together by this bond. So that bond is going to have a lot of energy because those molecules are wanting to push apart, but they're not allowed to. So the energy is in the bonds that hold that phosphate together. So when one of those bonds is broken, the energy is released. It's like if I were to take a spring and hold it right here and then suddenly release it, well, the spring wouldn't just fall, it would explode out. So this is what we call the ATP cycle. And in our body, we have ADP floating around, adenosine diphosphate. And it's just kind of floating around doing its little adenosine diphosphate thing, and then we add in some energy from food. We eat yummy, yummy, yummy food, right? So whenever we get that extra energy, we're able to attach another phosphate to it, which is where we get ATP, adenosine triphosphate. And whenever our body needs some energy, we just break off one of those phosphates, and suddenly we have energy for the cells. So this happens in the mitochondria. So what energy are we talking about? Again, we're talking about ATP. ATP is the only kind of energy that I'm going to talk about in this class. So anytime you hear energy in this class, you need to think ATP. So cellular respiration, how we harvest chemical energy. In our life, we need energy for lots of different things. We need it for building things so that we can grow. See this little baby right here? He needs to grow. We need it for reproduction. Here we've got some frogs with some eggs. We need it for active transport. We just finished that unit. This is where our body is needing to pump nutrients and chemicals and ions and all sorts of stuff into areas where there's already a high concentration. We need it for movement. And we need it to keep ourselves warm or for homeostasis. So where do we get that energy? The energy is all stored in organic molecules. Remember, these are our carbs, our fats, and our proteins. So we eat these organic molecules, this is what we call food, and we digest that food and break it down to get the fuels that we need for energy, or the ATP. We also break it down so that we can get raw materials that we need to build more molecules. And when we break it down, we use the process that we call cellular respiration. There are 2 different types. There's anaerobic, which does not require oxygen, and then there's aerobic, which does require oxygen. This is the formula for aerobic. C6H12O6, which is glucose, plus O2, which is oxygen, gives us CO2, or carbon dioxide, plus water, plus energy, or ATP. Now, when we go through cellular respiration, there's a couple stages, and the only stage that I'm really worried about right this minute is called glycolysis. Remember, we talked about lysis and how that means to break something. So we're breaking the glyco here, or the glycogen. This is the first stage. It's anaerobic. It happens in the cytoplasm, and the glucose is split into 2 pyruvate, or 2 pyruvic acid molecules. It requires 2 ATP, and it only gives 4 ATP. But because it requires these 2, we only net 2, because we've already used up 2 of them. So here we see glycolysis. It's a really complex activity. It's a really complex process. I don't really care that you know much about it, other than it happens in the cytoplasm, and it doesn't make a lot of ATP. So from glycolysis, we can either go to aerobic respiration or to fermentation. So let's talk about fermentation first. This occurs when there's no oxygen present. It allows the glycolysis to continue, and it doesn't produce any ATP. So we only get those 2 ATP that came out of glycolysis when we go through fermentation. And there are 2 types. There's lactic acid, which happens in animals. This is what causes your muscles to feel really sore after you've been working out. And then we have alcoholic, and it produces alcohol and CO2. It's what makes your bread rise, and it's what makes your bread smell really good whenever you get home and your mom or your grandma or your aunt or whoever has been baking bread. Now, aerobic respiration occurs in the mitochondria, and it requires oxygen. I want you to remember this because aero means air, or we think about your mom doing aerobics, and whenever your mom does aerobics, she goes a lot. She needs a lot of that oxygen, okay? It produces 2 ATP per glucose whenever we hit the Krebs cycle. This, again, is some extra information that you don't really need to know. The electron transport chain occurs in the inner mitochondrial membrane. Remember, the mitochondria is made up of 2 membranes. We get a lot of energy from electrons that we then use to create ATP. Oxygen is the final electron acceptor, so it grabs onto that electron and it makes the ATP that we need. We already talked about glycolysis. I don't know why that's on there twice. And fermentation. So, here are the key points that I want you to remember. Key point number 1, our body really likes aerobic respiration. When we go through aerobic respiration, our body actually creates 32 ATP per glucose molecule. When we go through anaerobic respiration, our body only produces 2 ATP per glucose molecule. So think about it. If you needed to go to work and you got paid $32 an hour, and you knew that Christmas was coming up, you were having some trouble feeding your family, and your boss said, you know what, you can work some overtime for $2 an hour. You would still do it. You wouldn't like it, but you would still do it. That's what our body does whenever we go through that lactic acid fermentation, whenever we're working out. We're working out, and then as soon as our body loses all the oxygen, it starts working harder in producing that lactic acid. So we've hit a lot of vocab today. Make sure that you've got that vocab filled out. Make sure that all the blanks are completed in these notes, and I'll see you soon.